night before my grandfather's will reading, I twisted the cap off my prescription bottle and felt nothing shift inside. No soft rattle, no weight, just air. I tipped it upside down over my palm. Not a single tablet fell out. The label was intact. My name, the correct dosage, the refill date from 2 weeks ago. The cap clicked back into place the way it always did, but the bottle was empty, and it was Thursday night, less than 12 hours before I was supposed to be seated in a probate attorney's conference room in downtown Charlotte. Without that medication, I don't drive. I stood there in my bedroom holding the bottle, calculating distance instead of emotion. 23 miles from my apartment to the attorney's office. Morning traffic on I-77. Parking garage ramps. If my pain flared the way it does when I miss even one dose, my right leg would weaken first. That's how it always starts. I would not risk losing control of a vehicle on an interstate. The risk wasn't abstract. If I didn't show up in person, my sister would control the narrative in that room. She has always been the one who coordinates everything for Grandpa. Appointments, paperwork, phone calls. She prefers it that way. I set the bottle on my dresser and opened the drawer where I keep my medication tray. The space was clean, too clean. I don't scatter pills. I don't move bottles around. I live alone and I manage my condition carefully. I work full-time as a project manager for a regional construction firm. I cannot afford to be careless with a controlled prescription. My refills are scheduled. My doses are counted. I pulled out my planner from my work bag and flipped to the pharmacy note I had written in ink the day I picked up this refill. Date confirmed. Quantity confirmed. I remember standing at the counter showing my ID signing electronically. Nothing unusual. I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to replay the last 2 weeks in order. I had not traveled. I had not left the bottle in a gym bag or overnight case. The bottle had stayed in this drawer. Tomorrow was not a casual family gathering. It was the formal reading of my grandfather's will at his attorney's office. My grandfather is 86. His health has been declining steadily for the past year. My sister Allison has positioned herself as his primary helper during that time. She lives closer to him than I do, and she makes sure everyone knows it. Over the past year, most updates about Grandpa's appointments, medications, and financial paperwork passed through her first. Relatives called her before they called him. Documents were emailed to her before anyone else saw them. She did not hold legal authority, but she held access. Allison has already been telling relatives that I tend to overdo it when I'm stressed, that I amplify things. I heard it in her voice last Sunday when we were discussing logistics. Calm, measured, almost sympathetic, as if she were managing me as much as she was managing Grandpa. If I called in the morning and said I couldn't drive because I was in pain, she would not describe it as a medical issue. She would describe it as another episode. I stood up slowly and felt the first tight line of pain run across my lower back. It wasn't severe yet, just a warning. I walked to the kitchen and back-testing balance. My right foot dragged slightly on the return. I checked the trash can, the bathroom counter, the top shelf of the closet. I opened the laundry hamper even though I never store medication there. Every search was methodical. I wasn't panicking. I was verifying. The bottle remained empty. There was one question I needed answered before morning. How did a controlled prescription I personally picked up disappear from a closed drawer in my apartment the night before my grandfather's will reading? I didn't have the answer yet. But I knew this much: if I didn't secure a record of what was happening before that conference room door opened, I would lose more than a seat at a table. I would lose my voice in whatever came next. I put the empty bottle back in the drawer exactly where it belonged and closed it carefully. Then I reached for my phone, not to argue, not yet, to make sure the absence of those pills existed somewhere outside of my own word. By 7:30 Friday morning, I was awake, dressed, and seated at my kitchen table with my laptop open and my phone beside it. The will reading was scheduled for 10 a.m. at my grandfather's attorney's office in downtown Charlotte. It was a normal business day. Offices were open. Staff would already be at their desks. If I was going to establish a record, it had to happen before anyone could describe my absence for me. I called the number listed on the letter we had all received 2 weeks earlier. The receptionist answered with the firm's name and transferred me to the probate assistant assigned to my grandfather's file. I identified myself with my full name, date of birth, and the file reference number printed on the notice. I kept my explanation factual. I stated that I was experiencing a medical issue that might prevent me from driving safely to the office. I did not use dramatic language. I did not accuse anyone. I asked 2 specific questions: whether the will reading would proceed if I were not physically present, and how my absence would be reflected in the file. The assistant explained that the reading itself was informational. The will would be read as written. Attendance was not required for its validity. However, the firm would note in the internal file that I had contacted them in advance and had cited a medical limitation as the reason I might not attend. That mattered. If I did not appear and said nothing, it would look like indifference. If I called and the call was logged, the record would show intent. I asked whether remote participation was possible. The assistant said that while the reading was not a court proceeding, the attorney could allow a phone line to be open if arranged ahead of time, provided all parties were informed. I requested that option be flagged in the file in case I could not secure transportation. I then asked that a short note be added that I had contacted the office at 7:42 a.m. on the morning of the scheduled reading to advise them of a medical complication affecting my ability to drive. The assistant confirmed the timestamp and repeated it back to me. I wrote the time down. When the call ended, I did not feel relief. I felt alignment. What began as a private disruption now existed as documented fact. If I arrived late or not at all, there would now be a neutral record that I had tried. I closed my laptop and checked the rideshare apps on my phone. Prices were already rising with commuter demand. Even if I booked one, there was no guarantee I would be able to sit upright for the full trip without medication. The pain in my lower back had sharpened since the night before. It was contained, but present. At 8:15, my sister texted the family group thread a reminder about the important morning and asked everyone to arrive 10 minutes early so the attorney wouldn't be kept waiting. Her tone was efficient, composed. I did not respond in the thread. Instead, I sent a short email to the probate assistant confirming that I had spoken with her and that I appreciated the notation in the file. I wanted a written echo of the conversation. Within minutes, I received a brief reply confirming receipt. Now there were 2 records. One verbal timestamped in their system, one written sitting in my inbox. If I failed to appear, it would not be because I forgot, overslept, or decided not to show up. Someone could still attempt to control the narrative in that room, but they would have to do it knowing there was a file that said I had called before the doors opened. I stood up from the table and tested my balance again. The question of how the medication disappeared was still unanswered, but the question of whether I would be erased without record was no longer open. By 8:30, my phone had shifted from quiet to constant. The first message came from my aunt in Raleigh. She wrote that she hoped I wasn't working myself up again and reminded me how important today was for Grandpa. 10 minutes later, my cousin added that Allison had already explained I was having one of my flare-ups and that we all needed to keep the morning calm. I hadn't spoken to either of them. The family group thread continued moving without me. Allison posted a reminder about parking validation at the attorney's building and added a short line about how stress can make certain conditions worse. She followed it with a gentle suggestion that everyone arrive centered and focused. The phrasing was careful. It didn't accuse me directly. It framed the situation as something predictable about me. I put the phone face down on the counter and opened my calendar. I still had a narrow window to arrange a ride. The will reading was at 10. With traffic, I would need to leave by 9:15 at the latest. I checked a local car service instead of the standard app this time, hoping for a driver willing to wait in case I needed extra time getting downstairs. The dispatcher said a car could be there at 9. The rate was higher than I would normally pay for a weekday morning. I confirmed anyway and asked for the driver's name and vehicle details to be emailed to me. I wanted a record of the reservation. Within minutes, Allison sent me a private text. She wrote that several relatives were worried about me and that she had reassured them I sometimes overdo things when emotions are involved. She added that if I felt unstable, it might be better to skip today and let her handle the logistics. She promised to fill me in afterward. I read the message twice. It was not hostile. It was managerial. I took a screenshot and saved it to a folder labeled with the date. I did not respond. At 9 o'clock, my phone rang again. This time it was my uncle. He asked whether I was really coming. He said Allison had mentioned that I tend to escalate situations and that the attorney would not appreciate disruptions. I told him I had already contacted the office that morning. He seemed surprised. He said he hadn't known that. That detail stayed with me. The narrative circulating among relatives did not include the fact that I had called the attorney before the office opened. It did not include that I had requested documentation of my situation. It included only that I was likely to create a problem. I ended the call politely and checked my balance again in the hallway. The pain had intensified, but I could still stand upright with care. My right leg trembled when I shifted weight, which meant the drive would have been risky, even if I had tried. At 9:10, the car service confirmed the driver was on the way. My phone lit up once more. Allison had sent another message to the group thread thanking everyone for being supportive and saying she was already on her way downtown to make sure everything runs smoothly. I watched the thread scroll without me. For the first time that morning, I understood the pattern clearly. If I failed to appear, the story would be simple. I had another episode. Allison stepped in. The day proceeded without disruption. If I appeared alert and steady, the dynamic in that room would shift. I would not be the fragile sibling needing management. I would be a named beneficiary present and capable of asking questions about timelines, asset listings, and signatures. If I did appear, the story would have to adjust. I slipped my phone into my bag and headed for the elevator, moving carefully, one hand along the wall for balance. The pressure was no longer just physical, it was reputational, and it was spreading faster than I could answer each message one by one. The car ride downtown took longer than usual. Morning traffic pressed in from every lane, and I sat in the back seat, focused on staying upright and steady. I kept my phone in my hand, not for messages this time, but for one specific number. When we reached a red light near the interstate exit, I called my pharmacy. The store had opened at 9. A pharmacist answered after a short hold. I gave my full name, date of birth, and the address on file. I told her I needed a copy of my recent refill history for my prescribed medication, including the date and time of pickup. She paused long enough to access my profile. Then she read it back to me. Refill authorized 14 days ago. Medication dispensed the same afternoon. Pickup recorded at 5:17 p.m. In-person counter transaction. Government ID verified as required for a Schedule II prescription. Signature captured electronically. I felt the air in the car narrow. At 5:17 p.m. that day, I had been at a client site in Huntersville. My company logs badge swipes at entry and exit. I had signed out at 6:12 p.m., and I had the email thread confirming a field inspection that afternoon. I asked the pharmacist whether the store kept an image of the electronic signature or just a record that one was obtained. She explained that the system retains a digital signature tied to the transaction and that I could request a printed medication history in person with identification. I asked her to note in my profile that I had called this morning with a concern regarding that pickup. She said she would add a comment indicating that I questioned the transaction. That mattered. If this moved beyond a family dispute, there would be a timestamp showing I had flagged the refill as potentially unauthorized. We pulled into the parking garage near the attorney's building, but I told the driver to wait a moment. I opened my work email and searched for the calendar entry from that refill date. The inspection confirmation was there, time-stamped, location listed. My supervisor's follow-up questions still attached. The pharmacy log said I had been standing at a counter across town at 5:17. My employment record said I had not. This was no longer about an empty bottle in a drawer. It was about a controlled substance that had been dispensed under my name at a time I could prove I was somewhere else. I paid the driver and stepped carefully out of the car. My leg held, though the pain pulsed harder now. I did not have a full explanation yet. I did not know who had presented ID or how that verification had been satisfied, but I had a documentable conflict, a pharmacy record on one side, an employment record on the other. If I failed to appear this morning, the story would be about my temperament. If I appeared and said nothing, the record would remain silent. If I appeared and kept moving forward, there would be two institutions whose timestamps did not agree, and that disagreement would not be a matter of opinion. I did not go home after the meeting. By the time I left the attorney's office, the pain in my back had become a steady, hot pressure that made every step feel deliberate. I could keep my posture in public. I could sit through a conference room chair, but I could not pretend that my body was fine, and I could not keep answering relatives in the hallway as if this was still a misunderstanding. The car service took me back to my apartment. I paid, thanked the driver, and moved through the lobby with my eyes on the floor. My building was quiet at midday. Most of my neighbors were at work. Inside my unit, I closed the door behind me and stood still for a few seconds listening. No voices, no movement, just the familiar hum of the air conditioner turning on. I went straight to the small desk in my living room where I keep my router and my home security hub. 2 years ago, after someone tried to force open the main entrance to our building, I had installed a basic system. One camera pointed toward the entry area. Another covered the hallway leading to my bedroom door. It was not elaborate. It was enough to know who came in and when. I had not thought about it the night I found the bottle empty. My mind had gone to the drawer, the missing pills, the immediate problem of the next morning. But the pharmacy record had changed the shape of the question. If my refill was logged as picked up when I was not there and my bottle was empty the night before the will reading, then my apartment was no longer just the setting. It was evidence. I opened the app and scrolled back to the date of the refill, then forward to the night before the will reading. The interface showed small thumbnail clips with timestamps. Most were boring me, coming and going, the delivery driver dropping a package, my neighbor walking past the lens. Then I saw it. A clip from Thursday afternoon while I was still at work. The timestamp aligned with my calendar entry from that day. The camera facing the entry captured a figure moving through the door with purpose, not hesitation. She did not knock. She did not pause. Allison. She was wearing a dark jacket and her hair was pulled back the way she wears it when she's running errands. She held a key in her hand. Not a building key. My key. I watched the clip again, this time slower. The door opened. She stepped inside. She closed it behind her without looking back. I switched to the hallway camera. There she was, walking toward my bedroom door without glancing at anything else. No searching, no curiosity, just a straight line. She entered my room and disappeared from the frame. 38 seconds later, she reappeared adjusting the strap of her bag. Her hand was clenched around something small and white. She slipped it inside the bag before the camera could catch it clearly. Then she left. The clip ended with my front door closing and the hallway returning to stillness. I sat back in my chair and looked at the screen until my eyes burned. The footage did not show the inside of my nightstand drawer. It did not show tablets falling into her hand. But it showed the timing. It showed the access. It showed intent. She had come into my home on the exact afternoon my pharmacy log said my refill was picked up by someone else. And she had done it without asking. My first impulse was to call her. I could feel my hand tighten around my phone. But I did not do it. Not yet. I exported the footage with its original metadata and secured duplicate copies, then summarized the timestamps in a single written note. I needed the evidence to exist beyond memory in a form that could not be softened, reinterpreted, or forgotten. When I finished, I realized my breathing had changed. It was shallow, controlled, as if my body was bracing for impact. This was no longer an argument about whether I was overdoing it. This was a person entering my home with my key on a day and at a time that matched a pharmacy transaction I could not have completed, and leaving with something that fit in her hand. I closed the laptop and looked at the locked drawer where I keep my important documents, my passport, my birth certificate, my lease. I added the empty prescription bottle to that drawer too. Then I turned the key. I waited until Monday morning. The will reading had come and gone. I had attended. I had taken my seat at the conference table, listened to the document as it was read, and left without turning the room into a spectacle. I had not mentioned the pharmacy record. I had not mentioned the footage. That restraint cost me. All weekend relatives replayed the morning through their own filters. Allison was praised for being composed. I was described as looking strained. No one asked why. By 8:45 on Monday, I was parked outside the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department's non-emergency intake entrance. I had printed the pharmacy transaction summary and my employment log showing my location at the time of pickup. The video file was saved on a USB drive in my bag. Inside, I explained that I needed to file a report for the unauthorized pickup and possible theft of a Schedule II controlled prescription issued in my name. The officer at the desk asked for identification and listened while I outlined the timeline. I did not speculate about motive. I stated facts. Prescription dispensed at 5:17 p.m. on a weekday when I was documented at work. Home security footage showing my sister entering my apartment later that same afternoon with a key I had previously given her for emergencies. Medication bottle found empty the night before the will reading. The officer asked whether I had confronted her. I said no. He asked whether I had proof she removed the pills. I said the footage showed access and timing. The pharmacy record showed pickup under my name at a time I could prove I was elsewhere. He typed steadily, then provided me with a case number. He explained that because this involved a controlled substance, the report would be reviewed and potentially assigned to a detective. If additional evidence was required, someone would contact me. There was no dramatic moment, no sirens, just a printed sheet with a reference number. That number shifted something. The situation now existed in a system that did not care about family narratives. From the parking lot, I filed the police report and sent a brief notice to the probate attorney's office, stating that a formal complaint regarding my prescription had been submitted. I requested that all estate communication remain in writing going forward. That same afternoon, I secured an urgent appointment with my physician to document the missed doses and requested a lock change through my landlord revoking any prior access. By the end of the day, 3 systems had recorded the same shift: medical, legal, and residential. The situation was no longer contained inside a family disagreement. Each step narrowed the space she could move in. Each step created another timestamp. By evening, my phone buzzed with another message from Allison. She wrote that filing anything with police was an overreaction and that it would only complicate things unnecessarily. I read it carefully. Complicate what exactly? The medication had been dispensed. The bottle had been emptied. My apartment had been entered. If I withdrew the report, the official record would stop at intake. If I continued, the next contact would come from someone whose job was to reconcile dates, signatures, and footage. I set the phone down and wrote the case number at the top of a legal pad. This was no longer about convincing relatives that I was not overdoing it. It was about whether a controlled prescription in my name could be picked up and removed without consequence. The report did not guarantee justice. It guaranteed process. And process meant the story would not be decided in a group text. By Wednesday afternoon, the locks on my apartment had been changed. The maintenance coordinator handed me 2 new keys in a small envelope and asked me to sign the work order confirming the prior spare key was no longer authorized. I signed and requested a copy of the completed service ticket by email. Within the hour, it arrived in my inbox. Allison texted me that evening. She asked why her key no longer worked. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I forwarded the lock change confirmation to a separate folder where I had been storing everything related to the medication issue. Then I replied in one sentence that access permissions had been updated and that future entry would require prior written agreement. Her next message was shorter. She wrote that I was escalating something that did not need to be escalated and that she had only ever used the key to help. The following morning, I received an email from a relative I rarely speak to directly. He asked whether I had filed something formal and warned that involving police could affect Grandpa's peace during a fragile time. The phrasing was careful. It did not accuse me. It implied that I was creating instability. I recognized the pattern. Pressure was shifting from my reliability to my loyalty. At work, I notified my supervisor of the flare and reassigned my field responsibilities for the week. The adjustment was logged before anyone else could question it. Later that day, I received a voicemail from Allison that was different in tone. She said she had spoken with an attorney friend who suggested that filing a police report without first verifying facts internally could expose me to defamation claims if accusations were unfounded. She encouraged me to reconsider and to withdraw the report before it grew legs. I listened to the message twice. She was not denying entry to my apartment. She was reframing my response as reckless. I did not call her back. Instead, I reviewed what I had actually done. I had reported an unauthorized prescription pickup documented by the pharmacy. I had preserved home security footage showing entry into my apartment. I had requested communication boundaries through the probate attorney's office. I had not publicly accused her in writing beyond stating that a report had been filed. There was nothing defamatory in reporting a discrepancy supported by records. That evening, I received an automated notification from the police department confirming that my case had been assigned to a detective for follow-up review. The email included a contact name and number along with instructions not to discuss details publicly while the matter was under review. The assignment did not mean charges. It meant someone beyond intake would examine the timestamps. Within an hour of that email arriving, my phone rang again. Allison's voice was tight this time. She said she had been contacted by an officer who wanted to schedule an interview. She accused me of dragging the family into something disproportionate. She asked if I understood what that could do to reputations. I said only that I had reported a discrepancy involving my medication and that the rest would be handled through the proper process. She hung up first. The balance had changed. Before the report, she controlled the narrative inside the family. After the assignment, she was responding to questions from outside of it. That did not mean I was safe. Relatives continued to send messages urging resolution. One suggested mediation through a pastor. Another proposed that I apologize for misunderstandings so everyone could move on. Each message attempted to narrow my options back to private settlement. I did not engage in those debates. Instead, I prepared a simple timeline document for myself listing dates, times, and corresponding records, pharmacy log, employment badge, swipe security footage, lock change, police case number. I did not send it to anyone. I kept it for clarity. The risk was no longer that I would be erased from a room. The risk was that sustained pressure might convince me to retreat from a process I had already set in motion. I chose not to retreat. But I understood that from this point forward, every action would carry weight beyond the immediate conflict. The detective called on Friday morning and asked if I could come in that afternoon. His tone was neutral. He said he needed to clarify a few points and formally collect the digital evidence I had referenced in my initial report. He gave me a specific time and reminded me to bring identification. I left work early with approval and drove downtown with the USB drive in my bag and the printed pharmacy log in a folder. The interview room was small, fluorescent lit with a table bolted to the floor. The detective introduced himself again, turned on a recorder, and asked me to confirm that I understood the conversation was being documented. I walked him through the timeline in order. Prescription issued by my physician, notification from the pharmacy that it was ready for pickup, transaction time-stamped at 5:17 p.m., while my employer's access log showed I was badge swiped into a client site 30 minutes away. Discovery of the empty bottle the night before the will reading. Security footage showing my sister entering my apartment earlier that afternoon using a key. He asked who else had authorized access to my apartment. I said no one. He asked whether I had ever given permission for someone to collect my medication. I said no. He reviewed the pharmacy printout and asked whether I would be willing to sign a release so he could obtain the original surveillance footage from the pharmacy counter and confirm the identity of the person who picked up the prescription. I signed the release. The case would no longer hinge on my home camera alone. It would be anchored to the pharmacy's own record. Before I left, he explained that if the footage confirmed that someone else collected a controlled prescription under my name without authorization, the conduct could fall under obtaining a controlled substance by misrepresentation and possibly theft. He did not promise charges. He described categories. On Monday afternoon, he called again. The pharmacy had provided surveillance footage pursuant to the release and a formal request. The timestamp matched the printed log. The person at the counter presented identification and signed the digital pad. The identification used was a duplicate of my driver's license number. The person in the video was Allison. The signature captured electronically did not match mine. The detective said he would need to interview her again in light of the footage and that the case would be forwarded to the district attorney's office for review once statements were complete. He did not speculate beyond that. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and wrote down exactly what he had said. The difference between suspicion and documentation is measurable. That evening, Allison called. She did not deny being at the pharmacy. She said she had picked up the prescription because she was concerned I would forget, and that she had intended to bring it to me. She claimed that any confusion about the signature was a clerical issue, and that she had believed she was authorized as family. I asked one question. Why did she not tell me she had it? There was a pause. She said she assumed I would accuse her of interfering, and that she did not want unnecessary conflict before the will reading. Her explanation shifted from concern to timing. Timing was the only element that benefited her. The pickup occurred the afternoon before the will reading. The flare began that night. If I had stayed home the next morning, she would have been the only steady voice at the table. The next day, the probate attorney's office sent a notice that a supplemental estate meeting would be scheduled to address administrative updates and to confirm beneficiary information in writing. The email was formal and included all parties equally. The process was tightening around multiple fronts. The police case was moving from intake to prosecutorial review. The estate administration was moving from informal coordination to documented confirmation. For the first time since the bottle was empty in my hand, I felt the center of gravity shift, not toward victory, toward structure. There was now external footage tying a name, a face, and a timestamp together. There was now an official classification of the conduct under review. I did not send updates to relatives. I did not argue in text threads. I gathered the detective's follow-up email, the pharmacy confirmation, and the estate notice into the same folder as everything else. And the sequence was no longer being written inside the family alone. 2 weeks later, I received a call from the detective asking me to come in again. By then, the district attorney's office had reviewed the file. He told me they needed a final clarifying statement before making a charging decision. The tone was procedural, not dramatic. I took a personal day from work and went downtown. In the interview room, he summarized the evidence now in the file, the original prescription. The pharmacy transaction log, the surveillance footage from the pharmacy counter, the electronic signature, capture my employment access record, and the home security footage showing Allison entering my apartment that afternoon. He asked me directly whether I had ever given verbal or written authorization for her to collect or store my medication. I said no. He asked whether I had ever received the medication from her after that date. I said no. He placed a document in front of me confirming that she had told officers she believed she had implied permission as family, but could not produce any message or documentation supporting that belief. Implied permission is not authorization. That distinction was written clearly in the report. 3 days later, I was notified that the district attorney had approved misdemeanor charges for obtaining a controlled substance by misrepresentation and for theft of property under a specific dollar threshold. The classification reflected the retail value of the prescription and the absence of prior criminal history. There was no arrest at my door. She was issued a summons to appear in court. The shift was quiet but definitive. The conduct had been named. Within hours of the notice being processed, my phone filled with messages. Allison had informed relatives that she was being dragged into court over a misunderstanding. She framed it as a bureaucratic overreach. One cousin who had once asked me privately if something felt off replied publicly that I had taken things too far. But the paperwork said otherwise. It listed the statute numbers. It cited the pharmacy video. It referenced the signature discrepancy. The following week, at the supplemental estate meeting at the attorney's office, she arrived with her own counsel. So did I. The probate attorney began by clarifying that the estate administration would proceed according to the will and that any pending criminal matter did not alter beneficiary status unless a conviction triggered specific disqualification clauses, which did not apply here. That mattered. The will was not a weapon, it was a document. But clarity about beneficiaries and asset distribution reduces the space for interpretation, and interpretation is where informal control lives. Then the attorney addressed communication concerns. All estate-related access to record scheduling and asset information would remain equally distributed to each named beneficiary. No single family member would serve as informal coordinator. That closed the channel she had previously occupied. When the meeting ended, she approached me in the hallway with her attorney beside her. She said she had never intended harm. She said this had spiraled beyond reason. She asked if I would consider requesting dismissal once she completed a diversion program if one was offered. Her lawyer added that for first-time non-violent offenses involving low monetary value, the court sometimes allowed deferred prosecution contingent on restitution and compliance. Restitution. The word settled heavily. I asked one question. Would restitution include written acknowledgement of unauthorized pickup and possession of my medication? Her attorney answered that any agreement would require a factual basis accepted by the court. That was not the apology relatives had urged me to accept. That was a recorded admission. The first court date was scheduled for the following month. In the meantime, the prosecutor's office requested that I submit a victim impact statement outlining the medical consequences of the missed doses and the effect on my work and personal stability. I wrote it carefully. I did not describe her character. I described the flare in pain, the documented missed refill, the days of limited mobility, the necessity of lock changes, and medical follow-up. Facts accumulate weight. By the time the court appearance arrived, the structure was complete. She stood before a judge and entered a not guilty plea, initially preserving her right to review evidence. Her attorney requested time to discuss diversion eligibility with the prosecutor. No verdict was issued that day, but the power imbalance that began with an empty bottle had shifted. She was no longer managing the narrative through suggestion. She was responding to a docket number, a statute citation, and a scheduled court calendar. The room was quiet when we stepped back into the hallway. There was no satisfaction in it, only the recognition that the consequences were now anchored outside of family opinion. And whatever came next would be decided in that forum, not at a dining table. The court date arrived 6 weeks after the initial summons. By then, the prosecutor had extended a formal diversion offer. If Allison agreed to a deferred prosecution agreement, she would be required to admit to a factual basis for obtaining a controlled substance by misrepresentation, complete a court-approved ethics course, perform community service hours, pay restitution equal to the cost of the medication and associated administrative fees, and remain arrest-free for 12 months. Upon successful completion, the charge would be dismissed, but the record of the agreement would remain accessible to the court. If she declined, the case would proceed to trial. On the morning of the hearing, she stood beside her attorney and accepted the agreement. The judge reviewed the terms in open court. The factual basis was read into the record that she presented identification using my driver's license number, signed electronically in my name, and obtained a Schedule II prescription without my authorization. She acknowledged the statement as accurate for purposes of the agreement. Hearing my own name spoken as a forged signature in open court felt colder than the pain ever had. It was not a public spectacle. It was a legal acknowledgement. The judge addressed her directly about the seriousness of controlled substances and the responsibility attached to them. Then he turned to me and confirmed that restitution would be processed through the clerk's office and that I would be notified upon payment. The gavel fell once. There was no applause. Outside the courthouse, she did not approach me. Later that afternoon, the probate attorney sent written confirmation that estate administration would continue under the original distribution plan, and that all beneficiaries had acknowledged in writing the communication protocol moving forward. No one would coordinate access alone again. Within 30 days, I received notice from the clerk that restitution had been paid in full. The amount covered the cost of the prescription, the pharmacy's administrative fee, and the lock replacement expense I had documented. The detective closed the case file as resolved via deferred prosecution agreement. The conduct had been named, reviewed, and placed on record. At work, my performance review arrived on schedule. There was no mention of instability or concern. My supervisor referenced the way I had managed a medical flare while maintaining project continuity. My life had not narrowed because I insisted on process. It had clarified. Allison completed her first ethics course session the following month. I know this because the diversion program required proof of enrollment filed with the court, and the notice was part of the public docket. We have not returned to the kind of casual access we once had. She does not have a key to my apartment. She does not handle estate correspondence. When we speak, it is measured. That boundary is not hostility. It is structure. I keep my medication in a locked drawer now, not because I expect theft, but because responsibility deserves reinforcement. The will reading that once felt like a stage is now just a memory of paperwork and chairs arranged around a table. What remains is not the inheritance itself, but the fact that control over my name, my health, and my access was restored through documentation rather than argument. I did not win by volume. I remained steady long enough for the record to speak. The empty bottle had started as a private disruption. It ended as a public record. The difference was not emotion, it was documentation. Thank you for listening.
This story is creative content developed for storytelling and reflection. It does not depict any specific real individuals or actual events.